So it is an honor to have this conversation with you all. My name is Farima Porkhorshid. I'm currently a teacher educator at the University of San Francisco. I'm also a core organizer for the Teachers for Social Justice, the People's Education Movement Bay Area, the Education for Liberation Network, and also work with Flourish Agenda. And so this conversation is a really important one to have. It has been an important conversation to have. So I just want to take this moment to say thank you to each of you for taking time out of your day to talk with us, knowing that you all have been fighting around this issue for quite some time. And so I want to introduce each of our panelists in this Freedom Talk. Shirazs is a junior at George Washington High School. She was born and raised in San Francisco. She plays softball and hopes to join the George Washington High School team next year. She's a proud student to be fighting against white supremacy and to be involved in the Paint It Down movement. Her dreams are graduating from high school and going into either paleontology or marine biology. So that is Shirazs. Thank you for joining us, Shirazs. We also have Mark Sanchez. Mark is actually the vice president of the San Francisco Board of Education. He's worked in the San Francisco Unified School District since 1993, and as a teacher, principal, and commissioner on the school board. He currently teaches 4th grade in Daly City. He's looped with his third graders from last year, and this is the best year yet of his career. He's also the co-founder of the Teachers for Social Justice. So we have a lot of love and respect for you, Mark. Thank you for joining us. Debbie Reese is tribally enrolled at the Nambe Pueblo, a sovereign native nation located in what is currently known as the state of New Mexico, a former school teacher who taught native and non-native children in New Mexico and Oklahoma. She was on the faculty of American Indian Studies at the University of Illinois, where she pushed the university to get rid of its stereotypical Indian mascot. Her work in children's literature led the American Library Association to change the name of one of its most prestigious awards. In 2018, the Laura Ingalls Wilder Award was renamed the Children's Literature Legacy Award. Thank you so much for being with us as well. Mary Travis Allen was born and raised in San Francisco and of Mayagna Nation on her mother's side and Seneca Nation on her father's side. Her children and grandchildren are all enrolled Oglala Lakota at the Pine Ridge Agency. She and her children and grandchildren all attended schools in the San Francisco Unified School District. She has been with the Indian Education Program since the 1980s. She's been an activist in her community since the occupation of Alcatraz in 1969 and has continued to fight racism and oppression over several decades. She has stood with many activists over the years and feels that there needs to be a new awareness and awakening to fight the current regime that is condoning and promoting prejudice, oppression, and crimes against humanity. So we have some incredible folks on this call right now. And again, we're just really honored to be in solidarity with you today. So if we can just start with you, Mark. If you can just give us a little bit of content and context about this situation. Some folks don't know really what's going on. So can you tell us a little bit about the Paint It Down mural campaign and how or why you got involved?
Sure, thank you. And first of all, I want to say I'm honored to be here with you all. I really respect all your work. So this is a historical issue. The murals were painted. It's a 13-panel mural. Called The Life of Washington. It's based in the lobby area, entrance area of Washington High School. It was done in 1936 as part of the WPA era work across the country. And in the 1960s, we don't really know about any protests prior to the 1960s, but clearly students of color didn't have a voice prior to the 1960s, where there were a lot of upheaval and around freedom of voice in the country. So in the 1960s, African-American students at the school, backed by the Black Panther Party, organized essentially protests around the mural's presence for the same reasons that people are protesting right now, because of the portrayal of African-Americans in the mural as well as Native Americans. And there was a compromise made in the early 70s where the district commissioned an African-American muralist, Dewey Crumpler, to paint response murals in another part of the building. There's 3 of them. And the issue I think sporadically came to people's attention over time between the 70s and now, but really in the last 3 to 4 or 5 years, Native American folks and others, but primarily Native American folks with the American Indian Project in San Francisco, Unified, have brought it to the school board's attention that this mural is problematic. And finally, we had a majority on the board that was actually listening to these protests, and we took it up. The district essentially commissioned a panel, reflection and action committee that met over the issue last year, 4 meetings, public meetings, and came to the conclusion that the mural should be taken down, painted over. The board eventually took that up as a resolution in June, and the resolution was to panel it over. I amended the resolution, essentially put forward a substitute motion to paint it over, and that got a unanimous vote on the Board of Education, which was, there was 1 member on the board not there, but 6 of us were there, and we voted unanimously to paint it over. And as people who are following the news have seen, that the media portrayal of our decision has been, I don't know the word, it's been mercilessly and relentlessly negative, and misportraying, I think, not just our decision, but why we made the decision, and essentially negating and ignoring the voices that we were listening to in their coverage of this decision to paint over the mural. And then this last Tuesday, the board retook up the issue, trying to strike a compromise. That's what the president of the board wanted to do, to essentially panel it over. And we're in the hopes of trying to keep a ballot measure off the ballot in March, which would overturn our decision. We don't know if that would be legally, that would be legally binding, but that would essentially be very divisive in our community. So we've seen divisions in our community along all different lines. It's been incredibly weird to see so-called progressives and even Communist Party members in San Francisco and the Bay Area and beyond linking arms with folks in Breitbart and the Daily Stormer and Fox News, and essentially having the same message, which is that we are censoring history and that we are wanting to paint over or whitewash what's happened in the United States. So that's essentially in a nutshell what's happened. I know others on this panel can add to that, and I'm glad to hear more about it, but that's, from my perspective, what's happened.
Thank you so much, Mark. If we can actually talk to Shirazs. Shirazs, you're a student at George Washington High School. As a student of color, as someone who has several peers and friends at the school, can you talk to us a little bit about what it's like for you just having to see the murals every day? What has it been like just in terms of your understanding and experience on the ways that people talk about the mural at your school or deal with the mural, and just organizing around this issue as a student?
Once I started looking, really paying attention to them, I realized that it was wrong. And I talked to a couple of my peers, and a student from Wash said that when they really look at the mural and really pay attention, it hurts them. It's hurtful, it's racist, and it's hurtful to look at.
I know that some of the controversy is around the fact that some people want the mural to actually stay, and they're saying that it's the fault of the school for not actually teaching the murals, and they think that students just don't understand the murals. So what has your experience been around this? Would you agree that other students just don't understand the mural?
Well, I mean, all of every student, I'm pretty sure, has been taught about American history, and once you learn the truth about George Washington, of his history and him owning slaves and him hiring soldiers to kill natives, it doesn't make the mural, looking at the mural, any better, knowing that he was a bad person. Even if the painter who painted the mural, Victor Arnautal, even if he's a good guy, that still doesn't, doesn't change anything.
Well, from your experience, have any of your teachers actually used the mural to teach you about American history?
No.
Thanks, Shirazs. And if there's anything else you want to add, just around, how this has impacted the school or your peers.
It's impacted a lot of students, especially like indigenous students and students of color. I'm sure that it's had like an effect on them.
Thank you so much for your perspective.
Yeah.
Mary Travis Allen, I know that you have been deeply involved with the Reflection and Action Committee. So can you talk to us a little bit about the Reflection and Action Committee? Talk to us a little bit about like what the San Francisco Unified School District's core values are and how that plays a role in this movement and ultimately the school board's decision.
Sure. Shirazs, thank you for your comments. I mean, I hear, and I'll get to that, a lot of other things that have happened during the course and why students don't pay attention to those things in their environment. But the Reflection and Action Committee, we had a student at the school, and the mother, Amy and Kai, that came forward at our Indian Ed to talk about this. And we do annual presentations to the board. And so, over the years, as part of Indian Ed, we've had to remind the board that we needed a location to work with our students. And we brought forward several issues. The issues about, and not just George Washington High School, but there are other schools that still promote images of Native people in a very derogatory way. My granddaughter went to Lowell for a couple of years, and previous to Lowell mascot being the Cardinal, it was the Lowell Indians. And so their ROTC, the girls still wear a costume that has arrows and fringe, and they wear headbands and wear braids and feathers, that they're not depicting cardinal birds. It's something that's been carried over as part of the tradition of the school. So in many ways, these alumni association people at schools like Balboa and other schools, that we need to do something to change that imagery and the names and everything, still hold on to these images and what they promoted at that time. George Washington High School, when you walk into the school, you first and foremost, there's a statue of George Washington, very prominent on the stairwell. And even though it may have been the intention of the artist to create this counter narrative about George Washington being the father of this country, which in of itself is a lie, you have these images. And you have to also understand that at the time those murals were put up there, it was a trend, it was, a fad or whatever you want to call it, that many artists were doing that type of artwork. So the fact that Artanov studied under Diego Rivera to learn those skills and then came back and was commissioned to create this imagery, nobody has spoken to his personal expression, quoted him in any way to say, this is what I meant. There's been a lot of interpretation around that, but no words from him to say, this is what I presented here, and this is what I intended. Sure, the art communities are going to say that these were people who were creating these counter narratives, and they were depicting the sign of the times and what the movement was at the time. And you got to remember, in that area, the Richmond district and the Sunset district, that they were now starting to be populated. And most of the people that were moving into those communities were, you know, working class people of Irish, Russian, Italian descent, and they were being given opportunity to buy these houses. You know, maybe first generation of immigrants here, but they themselves were carrying their own implicit biases against people of color and whatever else that was going on. So the school, you know, I've heard them blaming the school for not teaching the curriculum. Well, you know, we're talking 4, 5, 6 generations from the time those murals were put up there. So, you know, the schools are kind of run their own government. They have their own projects. They have their own intent. And also, if you go to, I think it's the Teachers Lounge, we just happen to have some of our meetings. If you look at the portraits of the principals on the wall, they were all white until the 70s, you know? So those people, with their textbooks and their education, they were just perpetuating what they were embracing in those messages. So those murals were meaningless. There was no context put to it. There was no educational value to continue to promote the fact that George Washington was a thief, liar, enslaver, prejudiced. There was no interest, and that's not what was being taught in the textbooks. So the Reflection and Action Committee was put together because there was a requirement for a process, right? We wanted to demonstrate that we were going to be compliant with the process, to engage in bringing together public commentary. We used it as an opportunity to try and educate and sensitize some of these people that had their mindset on just preserving that mural. So, you know, we went in depth. We gave education about the California natives and what historical trauma is and why those images, you know, are so offensive to the Native community, but also the Black community. And it was very clear from the start that the people that participated from the public comment weren't hearing anything. They had their minds made up. Lop came there to every meeting. His first introduction to me was, you know, who he knew, who he was connected to, and the fact that he was going to fight to keep those images up there. So there was no education, there was no sensitivity, there was no deterring. We had people, I think she was the librarian of the school, came to one of our meetings, and somehow she brought forth that she had just recently taken the 23andMe DNA kit and discovered she had Native American blood in her, and now she knew what we felt. We had a professor with us, Jolie Proudfit, who pointed out to her that there's no way you can feel what we feel. You have not been raised in the culture. You have not experienced, you know, the degrading, the racism, the imposition. You have not been there. And because you now discover you have a fingernail drop of blood in you, you can identify with that and with our culture, please. You know, the professor that wrote the book, about Arjanoff. That's all he went on about, you know. And Dewey Kumpler and all these other people that have come out of the woodwork didn't participate in those meetings. You know, it was of no value to them. And so we went through the process. We went back to the school board. The report was given to the school board. And so everybody had an opportunity of saying what they felt and what they were advocating for. And there was a vote that was taken on June 25th to paint over the murals. But clearly, you know, that decision was not upheld. And I think there was, you know, with the political pressure and all the stuff that went on in the media to label us as terrorists and people that were insensitive to art and the value of art. And, you know, it really sensationalized something that's much deeper than that. And we had hoped the school board would understand that more than anything, to not compromise that.
Can you talk to us a little bit about just the idea of reparations in this particular situation, and particularly around, like, why is it so important to stick to the idea of painting it down versus putting up panels? How does reparations play into this?
Well, reparation obviously is to repair, to bring forward and make good. Covering up, they covered it up before, and those coverings were taken down. Again, you know, whether it be the school, whether it be the school board, whether it be the community, whether it be the alumni, they came back and they uncovered it. We want permanence in that. Those murals need to be permanently covered up. You know, these people who are advocating anything, they should put their efforts into putting their funds together and see if a museum can take that and remove those frescoes and do everything else, if that's what they want to preserve. But they're not. They want to preserve that there, and it's of injury to every student that sees them, whether or not they ally themselves with Native Americans or the Blacks. It again desensitizes students. You know, the fact that they walk in there and they're immune to that until the day that they look up, you know. And then for our Native students who have a hard enough time to identify with anybody in the schools, we're labeled, we're categorized. I want to go back to my personal experience. You know, I was born in '56. So I went through all the typical old processes of reading those books and going home and talking with my parents about it, particularly my mom, and how offensive it was. How offensive it was. Those lies that were being told there. My kids, you know, my son wanted to go to Lowell High School. He had the grades. His name is High Horse. We gave him a traditional name. So there was no mistaking his identity, and we did the 506 and everything. I got a letter from Lowell High School saying he couldn't attend there because it would upset the ethnic balance of the school. Because in those days, based on the Bering Strait theory, we were categorized as Asians. That school is predominantly Asian. So he was excluded. So we had to go to the school board and fight that. We finally got an acceptance letter, but had to go. We had other plans after that. My daughter was paraded in front of a classroom. I think it was a literature class, and her teacher was German, as an example of Mongolians, because of the Bering Strait theory. And I took it up to the principal because, number one, parading a student in front of a classroom and identifying that child with no sensitivity to their culture was very awkward, to say the least. I spoke with the principal. The first thing out of her mouth, well, I'm part Native American. It didn't offend me. Really? You know? So reparation, it goes very deep. There's a lot that needs to be done. Those textbooks, they need to be reformed. You know, part of our advocacy is recognizing that our Native children have a right to speak their languages and is of equal value, if not more, in terms of the core values that the school represents and the necessity to get your diploma. Give them credit for speaking their language. Need to be culturally sensitive. We've spoken for years about how in biology class, among the Diné, they can't dissect frogs. It's offensive. That's against their culture. That's against their beliefs. But it has been imposed until recently. So reparation, this is a small drop. And it needs to be, we shouldn't have to go forward. The teachers know the offensive things that are on their walls, the names of the schools. You know, reparation, yes, but there's much to be done. And at the very least, I tell you, in hearing that this was going back to vote, felt so familiar about broken promises, you know? And compromise, no. You know, to say, well, everybody walked away unhappy. Really? You know, stand up for what you originally stood up for. You know, make it clear, because these other folks are going to continue on, and they've made it clear to bully and threaten and do whatever else they're going to do to preserve what they want there. And we can't let that happen.
Thank you so much for your perspective and just this ongoing fight that you've had to deal with. I can only imagine how difficult it is living in a city where so commonly people will say, oh, I'm a native San Franciscan. The same conversation with native people, actual native people. And so small things like that, I think it's really important for us to think about, all of us to think about. And in relation to that, Debbie, if you can just talk to us a little bit. We know that your work is really centered around critiquing the ways in which Native people are depicted in children's books. I think it's really important for us to have a conversation now around the notion of settler privilege. So if you could talk to us a little bit about what settler privilege means and how you see it unfolding in this controversy around painting down the mural.
Hi, thank you for inviting me to be with you all today. I do want to say that I'm not there in San Francisco or California. I'm many miles away. So I'm grateful for the opportunity to be here and share what I know as a person who studies children's books. And I'm a Native person, as you indicated at the start. And what we are becoming more aware of in the country is that term, settler privilege and settler colonialism, observing and naming the fact that these quote unquote settlers were not putting up their houses on land that didn't belong to anybody. It did belong to somebody, and it was taken in various ways over time. So becoming aware of words like settler and what they really mean is a new moment, I think, in the country. It isn't new to us. As Mary has been pointing out, we've been here and we've been talking about this stuff for a long time. Indigenous people, African Americans, these are our histories. We know these histories. We don't need to see murals for those histories to become known to us. So as I'm thinking about what you all are describing, it echoes what I see in children's literature, that we have most books for children, picture books and chapter books, are written by people who are not Native, are not African American, not are Asian American, are white. And they have histories, many of them, not all of them, because of course you can't know everybody's history, but that give them access. They have privilege to be able to do things that get themselves in the doors at the publishing houses and get their books published. Now, those books have terrible depictions of Native and people of color. What I see happening a lot is the justification of those derogatory and tragic Indian images as, well, that's what they thought back then. And the important question to that reply about anything is, who are you talking about? Who thought that and when? Because we have this mural here that seems that we are told was progressive for the time. But I'm sure that we would, if we were able to go into history, we would find Native people in the 1930s who said no to what Ornatov was doing in the way he was depicting Native peoples, because those were stereotypes. Even though people are arguing that the images in the mural are telling the truth, they're very stereotypical. They have no tribal markers of any kind that indicate what nations they're from. That's a huge omission. It collapses into the stereotypical idea that we're all the same. Feathers, fringe, naked people, violent, collecting scalps. All of that is in the mural. So I see the murals and the defense of the murals as an echo of what I've seen in children's literature for a long, long time. The idea that we are savage. And in terms of the people that are defending the mural, what I'm seeing them doing is speaking from that same white privileger space, even though they might not be white themselves. They are putting forth their elite appraisals of art and what art is, and what counts as art, whose voice to listen to, in the ways that they're dismissing Native people. Especially troubling to me as a Native parent is the dismissal of the Native families in the school and the Black families in the school, whose kids are looking at those images every day. And one only needs to look at the data for the graduation rates of Native and Black kids across the country, and it's not good. It's not where it needs to be. And I think murals like that contribute to that. Now, we had a little bit of conversation here too about not seeing the murals, walking past them. And I see that too in children's books. Whiteness has created an expectation that that's what this stuff looks like. Nothing to see, nothing to learn. That's what it looks like. But when we actually stop and examine and study the images and the text that is in a children's book, we see exactly what we see in the mural. Things that are not accurate. And that's a problem for everybody, not just the Native and non-Native kids, but the Native and Black kids, but the non-Native kids are being misinformed. They're being miseducated in a school. That is a violation and a betrayal of what a school is supposed to do. So those are some quick thoughts about what I see happening in parallels.
Thank you. It makes me think about the miseducation of Native and students of color throughout history, just the conception of schooling and how it was designed to miseducate all of us. So thank you for your comments around that. Can you also talk to us a bit about First Nation sovereignty and why it's important for educators to be teaching about this concept in the classroom, particularly around this issue as well?
Sure. I think that I'm going to hold up a book here that I think that I would like people to get. It's called An Indigenous People's History of the United States for Young People. It's a young people, like teenagers, copy of a book that came out in 2014 that I helped adapt. I'm a former school teacher. My co-adapter is also a former school teacher. We're both parents and raised our children in a school that had a racist mascot, in a community with a racist mascot. So we come at the adaptation from a very informed place of being. And what this book does is it starts with Native people, first and foremost. We were here first. Before the United States was the United States, these were nations of people all across the continent. The Indians that you see on the mural are stereotypical, and they're naked and they look primitive. They conform to that expectation that Native people were savages and primitive, when in fact, those early Europeans recognized that we were nations of people. That's why the treaties were made in the first place. You don't make treaties with animal-like creatures or primitive creatures. You make treaties with heads of state, with diplomats. That's completely missing from anything in those murals, no matter where you are in the staircase or on the main floor or in those alcoves. The intellectual and the diplomatic conception of who we are as nations of sovereign people is just not there. That book starts there. I think that the murals need to start there too. Whatever happens in those hallways, and I do agree, I think those murals just need to come down and be replaced with a more accurate history of the United States that centers the indigenous peoples of California, because they're missing from the curriculum that I've seen. We have, in California, I see Mission Indians and Island of the Blue Dolphins, both of which are highly problematic because they don't center Native people. That's whiteness and white perspective, white misrepresentation over and over. So the sovereignty is important, and it's just not taught. It is not taught in most schools of education, and certainly doesn't get into schools that children attend. There's there's like multicultural grids, like, you know, this is the food these people had, this is the history of these people, and in a grid-like format, you can plug in African American and Asian American in that grid, but there is no grid that says sovereign nations. So that just gets erased, and we see that erasure over and over, and we need to bring that forward.
Thank you so much. And in relation to that, I want to just open up this conversation to all of us. You know, the Teachers for Social Justice, we have thousands of educators, a range of educators, school counselors, administrators, grassroots organizers, classroom educators, teacher educators, right, who will be watching this, this conversation. So from each of your positionalities and your perspectives, what advice do you want to give educators in this moment?
It is interesting, though, that so many educators in the Bay Area and beyond, obviously, are not aware of some core issues that we've been talking about today. Sovereignty, just how Native Americans have been represented, and African Americans in our history, and how that representation has been false all the way along, and that we have been unable to this day to address it in an adequate way. So for educators, I think just being aware of what's happening. This is a current moment, it's a moment in time, but it actually represents the arc of history in this country, and how we have failed collectively to have a reckoning. And whether it's reparations or just having accuracy in our textbooks, we have collectively failed. And I think for educators, we need to be aware of that, and then be prepared to act on it. And that's difficult. I think most educators actually are so constrained by what they can and cannot do in their classrooms that they feel bottled up oftentimes. And so I think breaking out of those chains, and you know, I think T4SJ is a great forum for it, because it brings people together that are like-minded, or even people that aren't that like-minded, to grapple with things collectively. So I think for educators, taking this on isn't just taking on a momentary fight. It's being educated about the history of this country and moving forward proactively.
So I think, you know, everything that Mark said is absolutely on point. You know, I recognize that many educators, especially within a city government, I work for the city, so, you know, we're always facing financial constraints and processes and all this other thing, understaffing. And then couple that, especially here in the city, with just the cost of living, housing, all those things that impact a person feeling good about themselves. But I think here's the other thing. When you become an educator, you have a responsibility. You're making permanent impressions on the minds and people that are subjected to you, your opinions, your behaviors. And there are many people in the school system that need to go. They're still locked into that old, you do it my way and you learn what I want you to learn and process people through. Sensitivity, you know, we need to do better in the schools. You know, the people here in this country, I mean, it seems like you start there. You know, anybody that has existed in this country from the 60s on should be aware of the struggles of people in this country, certainly now in these times. My God, look what we're facing and experiencing. That needs to be taught in school. There needs to be discussion about it because there's real things going on at home. Debbie touched on so many points. They're absolutely vital. Those images, the Indian people that are in those images, and I also want to remark, you know, people that I got inundated with Facebook comments from people, you know, telling us that we need to go back to living in caves. And I owed some woman $600,000 for all her ancestors that were scalped by my people. And, you know, the ridiculousness and the offensiveness of it. But look, this administration that's over there in that White House is giving permission to that. You know, children being worried about going home and whether or not their parents are going to be there. You know, the media showing these children being put in cages like animals. Well, tell history correctly. Native people were corralled and put on reservations. We had to offset our lifestyles, how we live, how we respected where we live, how we would move with the seasons. You know, the stereotyping. Many of our children, you know, are multiracial, but culturally are raised as Native children. And they're confronted all the time, well, you don't look Indian. Well, you know, that's promoted by those images in the books and what they see in the media. Teachers have a responsibility. Those books, those textbooks, burn them. Oh my God, I'm saying burn books now. We were admonished about that. There's so much that needs to be done to repair the education system. Amos Brown stood up there and was telling us what we should feel. My God, man, really? Do you believe what you were told how you should feel? You know, I had to point out about the fact he was forgetting about Native people helped Black people escape slavery in this country. We wouldn't be there to say anything if somebody didn't risk something, their lives, for us to be here. Teachers need to recognize that. They need to come out of their bubbles and their, you know, lunchtime breaks and everything and talk about what's real important to the students that they're educating in that exposure.
I agree with Mary and Mark. And as an educator of myself, I think that I want to learn more about my ancestors and my history from school. And I also agree about the textbooks and that they should be burned because it's like it's not like we're not learning. We need to learn more about like real history and about people of color, and I don't get to learn about that, like, barely. And I think schools and teachers do have a responsibility, and that they should teach what's important and what's going on in our society, because we all need to know that, and we all need to be aware of what's going on. And we can't be aware and know unless someone's taught us that, unless someone teaches us that.
I think what I want to say to teachers is that parents trust you. Don't violate that trust with problematic books, because you will have parents and students who are hurt by that. You will have parents and students who will confront you about that. And when that happens, be willing to hear what they have to say and don't talk over them. Listen to what they have to say. When a parent comes in with a book about the gold rush, because in this country, we tell such warm and wonderful and way cool stories about the gold rush and getting rich. We have these picture books that show this little old guy on his mule with his little pan and working in the water to get some little gold nuggets. That was a little piece of the gold rush. The larger piece of the gold rush was very devastating and destructive to the land, and it was absolutely murderous to Native people who called those their homelands. So look very critically at picture books about the gold rush, chapter books about the gold rush. Don't use them. Or if you are going to use them, get out a Sharpie and teach kids, you know what, we can write in this book because this fact here is wrong. Teach kids that books are not sacred. Art is not sacred. Their well-being, that is a sacred trust that parents put in teachers. So I want teachers to think very carefully about every single book they want to bring into the classroom and what it's telling children about this country and the people in this country.
Debbie, can I also ask, as a former kindergarten teacher who always taught about colonization in kindergarten, you know, negative feedback from colleagues and sometimes even parents who said, you know, kids are too young to be learning about that. You have to protect their innocence. They don't need to know those kinds of things. What would you say to folks who believe that, who think that way?
I have on my blog a post that was written by a fifth grader in Ohio, who in fifth grade, her teacher was giving her an accurate lesson about history. And this is where that very strong word for me, betrayal, comes into play, because she said, wait, you mean all those smiling Indian worksheets that I've been doing since kindergarten were wrong? And I think nobody wants to be the teacher that betrays a kid. Nobody wants to have that child come back to them and say, why did you do that to me? So I think that we can look to children who are older, like Taylor, not that post on my site, and I can send you the link to that so you can add it somewhere here to the website for where you're going to have this particular video. Listen to the kids who are telling you that this is wrong. And I think that's the answer, is that we're misleading kids, and they're not going to like it when they get older and learn that they were misled. And the other thing is that Native kids, Black kids, grow up with this history. They know these histories, in part because that racism and anti-Indian, anti-Indigenous legacy is still part of the present day. Our kids are not safe. My kids are not safe at a mascot protest. African-American kids are not safe on the streets. We have to teach our kids what they need to do to be safe. They are raised with that. So it's privilege for white parents to think, oh, I don't have to deal with that right now. It's wrong.
Yeah, and it's also privilege to assume that all students aren't already dealing with those kinds of lies and narratives as well, right? Yeah. So, you know, I know that one of the things that has been coming up, particularly around former Mayor Willie Brown and other folks of color who have made comments around, you know, these young people just need to toughen up. There's the narrative of like, they're being sensitive. You need to just deal with the history. What would you say to folks who have that perspective, that the students and families who are saying they're being re-traumatized by these images, or that they feel harmed or hurt by this? what would you say to those folks that are saying they need to toughen up? And so just to let you all know, this video will be made public to educators, students, to people all around the world. And so we hope that with this conversation, folks would have a deeper analysis on this issue and hopefully make some changes. So thank you so much to each of you.
Thank you for
Thank
moderating.
you.
Thank you.
Thank you for inviting.
When you walk into the main lobby of the school that my kid goes to, immediately I see shirtless Native people. One of them has a human scalp adorning their belt. And I know the practice of scalping was brought to this land from European settler colonials. It's forgetting that we were greatly attacked and assaulted and murdered. We are not the first who are feeling the harm and the hurt and the intergenerational trauma by these racist stereotypes on the walls. Black and Indigenous kids have been talking about this, and communities have been talking about this for a very long time, at least for 50 years. And that's the history that's repeating itself, is that people are not listening to the most impacted communities who are damaged and harmed by the images that are up there. I don't forget where I came from. I don't forget the forced assimilation policies and the genocidal policies that were brought against my people. I can't forget those things. I see them still today. The first boarding schools and residential schools were taking American Indian people, Indigenous people away from their families, and it was murderous. And then I see today how there are children in cages. If we take this little chunk out of white supremacy thinking and white supremacy culture inside San Francisco and inside the school district, then where else is white supremacy going to lose? I don't need to be in my head about this. I don't need to intellectualize about this. When I hear from kids that it's painful, that it's damaging to them, I listen to that. It's time to paint them down. It's time to paint over them. It's time to make the change that has been promised for a long time.